Zachas Yevamos Daf Beis continues the discussion of forbidden relationships, which ones are forbidden, which ones are secondary, and which ones are permitted. There is one Mishnah which divides the Daf into two. The first part of the Daf contains the list of the 6 additional shnios mentioned by Rabbi Chia. In his brayso, the Gemara will also talk about converts and whether their relationships are severed when they convert, and therefore they're allowed to marry those that they were not allowed to marry before. And the Mishnah will introduce us to the topics of forbidden marriages that create relationships that aren't considered to be real relations. So let's begin. The Gemara has already seen the list of the 8 shnios, the 8 secondary arayos midrabanan mentioned by Rav, and now the Gemara has a list of 6 more mentioned by Rabbi Chia, and they are 4th generations. So there is one's granddaughter, whether it's through a son or through a daughter. So the granddaughter themselves is a erva, the great-granddaughter, that is the son's daughter, or the daughter's son's daughter. Those are 2 shnios, according to Rabbi Chia. You also have the same relationship with one's wife's great-granddaughter, through a son or through a daughter, that's 4. And then you have 4 generations up, that's one's wife's grandmother on either side. That's one's mother-in-law's grandmother or one's father-in-law's grandmother, 4 generations up. So these are all the 6 shnios of Rabbi Chia. Now, when the brayso of Rabbi Chia lists it, it refers to those descended, one's great-grandson, one's great-granddaughter, and one's wife's great-granddaughter, as the shlishi, the 3rd generation. That's because it's not counting the person himself or his wife. They're both referred to as 3 generations later, so that's the great-grandchildren. However, when it refers to the mother-in-law, that's referred to as a revi'i. It refers to the grandfather, the grandmother, or when it refers to the grandmother of the father-in-law or the mother-in-law, it refers to that as a revi'i. That's 4 generations up, meaning it's counting the wife as part of the 4 generations. It's one's wife's, mother's. So that's 4 generations. And the Gemara wants to know, how come when we discuss the generations below, we call it a shlishi? We count 3 generations, not including the present generation, but when we count generations up, we do include the present generation, and we call it 4 generations. So the reason is because when you're referring to the person himself, he himself is not part of the Isser. It's 3 generations below him. Those are the generations of Isser, so we call it a 3rd. Now, when we're referring to his wife, so when it's going up, so his wife is part of the generations from him. It's part of the creation of the Isser. So going up 4 generations, I understand why it's called 4. Now going down, why is it called 3? That's just because since we called generations down from him himself, we called it 3. Generations down from his wife, he also called 3. But really it should, it could be called 4. You could count his wife as part of the generations of Isser because she is one removed from him. Okay, those are the 6 arayos, the 6 shnios of Rabbi Chia. Now the Gemara wants to know, do these continue for generations further, or do these stop at the 4th generation? Do you go further up and further below, or are all called shnios or not? So the Gemara says, let's try a couple of proofs on that. First proof would be because in our brayso discussing the shnios of Rav, we said that there were only 4 that continued generation after generation, and that does not include these. These are not on the list. The Gemara says it doesn't necessarily prove that they don't continue generations after. It could just be that they were left off the list because that list was only in that brayso. 4 out of the 8 in that brayso continue 4 generations afterwards, but this is not in that brayso. It does not mean that they also don't continue 4 generations after. So Gemara says, well, maybe you could prove from the fact that it's called a 3rd generation and a 4th generation. The fact that we give a number seems to indicate that it's limited to that number. No, not necessarily. Maybe just we're saying starting from that number, starting from the 4th generation up, or the 3rd generation down, that's where it begins the list of shnios, but they continue to be shnios afterwards. Okay, the Gemara now moves on to discuss gerim, converts. Now about a ger, we have a rule that a ger who converts is kikaton shano adam. He's considered like he was just born. He's a new birth. He's not considered related to any of the blood relatives that he had before he converted. So the Gemara says, we know that there is a gzeira, there's a gzeira, minarbanan, that the arayos de'iraisa are aser. He's not allowed to marry his former mother, sister, daughter, any of those, even though he's not considered related to them anymore. And the reason is because, first of all, they will be confused. If we allow the ger to marry them, we could potentially end up allowing non-converted Yisraelim to marry them. And second of all, we shouldn't have the appearance of him having converted from Kedusha Kala, from Kedusha Chamura, Kedusha Kala. The conversion to Judaism should add levels of holiness, and which would therefore add restrictions. It should not decrease it. So he shouldn't be permitted to do things he was forbidden to do before. The Gemara says that Rava said to Rav Nachman, the Rabbanan came from Eretz Yisrael, and they said that in Eretz Yisrael they were asking, what is the halacha of shnios? The Rabbanon relationships, do those also exist by the ger or not? So the Gemara said, for sure not. He answered and he said, no, even the ones that are deiraisa by a regular Yisrael are only derabanan by a ger, so the shnios will be mutter completely. You don't have to have those. You don't have to be concerned about kedusha kala, kedusha chamura. So the Gemara says, once we're on the topic of the gerim, Rav Nachman said, I'd like to add something. And that is that two brothers that converted, and now they're not related anymore, are they still considered to be relatives or not? Nafkamina is, can they testify together? Witnesses cannot testify if they are related to each other. So it makes a difference if we're talking about brothers that share a mother or brothers that share a father. Brothers that share a father have two reasons that they're not related. Number one, each one is considered to be newborn when he converted. Number two, the father outside of Yisrael, fathers are not misyaches to their children because the Torah was mafkir, the zera of the father, like it says in Yecheskel, zer masusim zer masam. So there is no ancestral relationships created outside the rubric of Klal Yisrael. So there's two reasons that they're not considered related. So if they are brothers from the father only, everybody agrees that they're not related and they're allowed to testify together. If they're brothers from the mother, so you don't have that zera aspect, you just have Kekatan Shanola Dami. So there you have a machlokes between Ameimar and Rav Nachman. Ameimar says that they are allowed to testify l'chatchila. They're not considered related because they're Kekatan Shanola Dami. And Rav Nachman says that they are not supposed to testify, but if they do, it counts. Now, why is it different than Arayos? Arayos, we make Xer, we consider them to be related as far as Arayos are concerned, at least Min Rabbanan, so we shouldn't get confused, and allow Yisrael to marry an Erva. So why should we not allow them to testify either, lest we allow two brothers that are Yisraelim to testify? Where says the difference is that a testimony always happens in a Beis Din, and you don't have to make Xeris in the Beis Din. The Beis Din is presumed to know the halacha. Marriage is given over to everybody, and therefore we have to make restrictive rules to limit that. This takes us to the next Mishnah. The Mishnah continues the topic of who's called a brother halachically and who's called a son halachically. And it will say that every brother is a brother halachically and every son is a son halachically unless they are born from a shivcha or from a avedas kachavim, from an akam. So let's read the Mishnah. Mishnah says any type of brother creates a yibum obligation. So if he has a brother, any type of brother, whether no matter how he's related as a brother, could create a yibum situation if his brother were to die without children, except for a brother that they are brothers through a shifcha or through an ovedis kachavim, then they are not brothers. Now, every type of son, pater is yibum. Any father who has a son his wife does not fall to yibum if he dies, and he also has the isser of hitting his father and cursing his father, which carries misa. The exception to that is again a son who's born from a shefcha or from an ovedes kochavim. Now, the phrasing in the Mishnah was mikol makom. Any type of brother at all. So what does that come to include? So Gemara says that comes to include a mamzer, even a brother who's a mamzer. Gemara says for sure. Why should I think not? A mamzer is a brother. Just because he's not allowed to marry in doesn't mean he's not a brother. Gemara says no. You may think that there's a drasha that excludes a mamzer, and that's the word achva. It says the word achem by the shvatim and says the word achim by yibum. Just like the shvatim were all ksherim, you may think that yibum is only when they're all ksherim. The Gemara says, how do you know that that's taki not true? The Gemara says, I learned that from the fact that as a son he works to pater yibam, therefore as a brother he works to create yibam. As the son he works to pater yibam, the Gemara says, comes from the drasha that says ayin alav, which we shall see soon. Now, as far as that he's a brother for all other halachos, what other halachos is he a brother for? So the Gemara says he inherits together with him, and if they're kohanim and he dies, he's allowed to be metamei to him. So again, the Gemara says, what's the chiddush? Obviously, he's a brother. Why not? The Gemara says because in the psukim describing that a kohen is allowed to be metamei to his close relatives, it says l'she'ero hakarav elov, to his she'ero. She'ero refers to his wife. Therefore, you may think that the halachos of a brother is the same as the halachos of a wife, and not every wife is a kohen allowed to be metamei to. Which ones is he not? So we have a pasuk that says lo yitame bal ba'ama v'heichalo. Some he could be metamei, some he can't be metamei to. A wife who's a kosher, who is allowed to marry, he can be metamei to. A wife who is not allowed to marry, he is not metamei to. So you may think that an ach who's a puzzle, just like a wife who's a puzzle, an ach who's a puzzle. So an ach who's a mamzer, a brother who's a mamzer, the kohen cannot be metamei to. So how do you know that's not true? The Gemara says because there's a difference between the two. The brother is going to stay a brother. The wife who is not supposed to marry must leave. Okay. Now, the Gemara says, what is the reason that a brother from a shifcha doesn't count? The Gemara says that's because the Torah says, that's the woman and her children stay with the master, and therefore they are part of that family. They're not part of this family, and therefore they're not considered to be brothers at all. The Gemara does not discuss it. Rashi references later where we'll say that relationships go through the mother, and therefore if the mother is a guy, then the kids are a guy and not considered related. Now, says the Gemara further, how do you know that when it says a son, any type of son is considered to be a son as far as Hilchos Yibam, what's that referring to? The Gemara says that's to include a mamzer. And again, how do you know that? Because the Torah says ubein ein lo, and describes the mitzvah of Yibam, says ubein ein lo. Rashi says the word ein has an extra yud. It doesn't need to have a yud there. It could just have said ubein an lo, which would mean that he doesn't have a son also. The yud is to teach me, read it as ayin lo. You should look very hard for sons, and anything which could theoretically be considered a son counts as one, and therefore mamzer counts as one as well. Okay, now we had said that one of the halachos that his son is considered a son for is that he's not allowed to hit his father, and if he does, then he gets misa. So the Gemara says, why is it true that the father who gave birth to a mamzer has this right? There's a pasuk that says v'nasi ba'amcha lo sa'ar, which says that the halachos of cursing or hitting one only accounts to osa ma'isa amcha, somebody who's ba'amcha, somebody counts as part of the nation. This person is obviously violating an iser arayis if he gave birth to a mamzer. So when it says it's referring to where he did tshuva, and therefore he's now considered to be an osa ma'isa amcha. Where it says, what do you mean? Rishon ben Menachsi says in a Mishnah, there is no tshuva for somebody who gave birth to a mamzer. It's a ma'uvus lo yichol liskon. It's a disaster that can't be fixed. Sumar says that's referring to the fact that he cannot fix what he did in the world. The output of his avera has been created, and he can't get rid of that. However, he still restores the status of being an osa ma'isa amcha, and therefore he does have the right to his son not allowed to curse or hit him. Now the Gemara moves on to discuss what happens if somebody has beer with his sister. How many lavin, how many yisurim of course does he violate? The Gemara is going to say this is a machlokes. So let's explore first, as an introduction, the two psukim discussing a sister. The Torah refers to a sister twice. First, it says, "Ervas achoscha bas avicha avas yimecha maledes bayis maledes chutz lo segala ervasan." This says the sister who is the daughter of one's father or the daughter of one's mother. Now, that's one isser. Then you have a separate isser where it says, "Ervas bas eishes avicha," the daughter of your father's wife. So obviously the first pasuk is not talking about the father's wife. The first pasuk is talking about a woman, a girl who was born to his father out of wedlock, still a sister through the father, but not the daughter of the father's wife. Then the second pasuk talks about the daughter of the father's wife. It says, "Eres bas eishes avicha maledes avicha achos chahi." That's the phraseology that's used. The daughter of the father's wife, born to the father, so it's not talking about her pre-existing wife, and it says achos chahi, she is his sister. So the Gemara says in Machlokes between the Rabbanan and Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda, how many lavin does one violate if he is together with his sister, who is the daughter of his father, And his father's wife, that is a sister that was born from his father and his father's wife. Not necessarily is he a sister through the mother as well, but through the father and the father's wife, meaning that she was born to the father in wedlock. So according to Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Yehuda, he only violates one Isser, and according to the Rabbanan, he violates two Isurim. Why? Because both apply. She is both the daughter of his father and the daughter of his father's wife, so both apply. The fact that the Torah said both Lavin is to show that both Lavin exist. Says that's the opinion of the Rabbanan. Rabbi Yehuda says you learn from the fact that it says achoschahi, that in the case of the one who is the father's wife's daughter, it's called achoschahi. He only gets the isser of achoscha, only isser of being the sister. You don't split it into two types of a sister and call her a sister twice and make it two isurim. Just called sister. That's what's rounded up. It's just the love of a sister. There's two ways to be a sister. Could be the father's daughter, could be the father's wife's daughter, but it's not considered to be two different isurim you could get at once. Okay, now the Gemara has to explain what are the Rabbanan going to do with the extra words achos chahi. What's that for? So the Gemara says achos chahi is to tell you that one is chayev for the sister who is both the daughter of his father and his mother. Now you would think that that's obvious, because if he's chayev, it specifically says he's chayev for the daughter of his father, and it says he's chayev for the daughter of his mother. Certainly he's chayev for the daughter of both of them. So Gemara says that would be a kal v'chomer, and the pasuk here is teaching you the halacha that you do not create onshin, you do not create punishments based on a kal v'chomer. So that's why it specifically spelled this one out to show you that a kal v'chomer would not have been enough. So the Gemara says, how does Rabbi Yossi or Yehuda going to know that halacha? So Gemara says that's from the fact that it says achoscha and he. It could have just said achoscha. That would have taught me that achoscha, your sister, that's a full sister, then he's chayav for it, and that's to avoid the kal v'chomer. What's the he for? The he is to tell you this is the only isur you get, and not a different isur. You don't get two isur. So now, whether Rabbanan going to do with the he, that's extra. The Gemara says no, you need the he for the same point. If it only say achoscha, you would not learn from here that you never use a kal v'chomer to teach an onish. You would say, okay, this case I have the Torah spelled out something I could have learned from a kal v'chomer, because we have a rule. Sometimes the Torah will say something that I could have learned on my own with a kal v'chomer. It says milsa the asav kal v'chomer tarach v'kasav lakra. Sometimes the Torah will do that, but this doesn't teach me that all around the Torah you can never use a kal v'chomer to teach an onish. You always have to have a extra source for that. So for that it says achos chahi, to teach me that this. I'm specifically telling you that I need this kal v'chomer, that I need this drasha, because the kal v'chomer is never enough to teach me what an onish is. Says the Gemara, what's Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda going to do with that argument? So Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda says, if that were true, if it was really just we could have written achos chahi in the other pasuk, that is the pasuk which is not talking about the mother and the father. That's the one that says Evas achoscha bas avicha ovas imecha maladas bayis oy maladas chutz. That shows either one. You should have written there achos chahi to add the sister that is from both the mother and the father. This pasuk is talking about one from the mother and the father, because it says Evas bas eshes avicha maladas avicha. It says both together. Why does it have to say achos chahi there? It should have said it previously. That teaches me what the Rabbanan wanted to learn here. The Gemara now asks, according to Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Yehuda, what is the purpose of the pasuk bash eshes avicha, the daughter of your father's wife? In that case, it's only one isser chosel anyway, so it's not adding anything. So Gemara says that is needed to show that the isser is only if it's an eshes avicha. If the daughter is only someone who has a possible full wife relationship, to exclude the daughter of a shefcha or an avedas kechavim. If that's who she's born from, then it would not be considered the father's daughter, because it's the daughter of a goy or of a shefcha, and therefore there would be no isser there midoraisa. So Gemara says, how do you know that's what it's excluding? The fact that it says eshes is to exclude that there's no isser on a girl who's born out of wedlock. Previous pasuk just said the father's daughter, which seemed to indicate even out of wedlock, but here it says wife, so maybe it's limiting what we said before, and it's only if it's in wedlock, not out of wedlock. Gemara says, no, that can't be, because relationships out of wedlock still count as relationships, and we see that from Rava. Rava said, I have a contradiction in Psukim. The Torah says one is usher on his granddaughter. It says, Evas bas bincha ay bas bitcha lo segale. That implies that it's only his own granddaughter, but not his wife's granddaughter. However, we have a different pasuk that says, Evas isha ubita lo segale es bas banav es bas bita. That clearly shows that she is also on his wife's granddaughter. How do you resolve those two? So the Gemara says it's talking about out of wedlock, meaning to say that his own granddaughter that's born to him out of wedlock he's usher in, but his wife's granddaughter who's born out of wedlock, that is, she's not his wife, a granddaughter that's born to a woman out of wedlock to him, that is usher to him if it's his own daughter, but not if it is someone else's daughter. So that's if he has a child with a woman, he has a grandchild with a woman out of wedlock, that child's usher to him, but that woman's other children from other men is not usher to him. But what we see from here is that a child born out of wedlock is considered a child. So if that's true, then a brother that's born out of wedlock would also be considered a brother, and a sister as well, and they can't be listed separate. That it cannot be excluded.